Before we open these oldest chapters, write in the comments which city you are listening from. And if this lore speaks to you, subscribe so these chronicles may continue. What follows is not a legend told by bards, but the careful unsealing of truths recorded long before mortals learned to name the stars. Existence did not begin with Faerûn, nor even with Toril. It began with structure. In the deepest records preserved by sages of the realms, reality first appears not as land or sky, but as division. There was the distinction between being and nothingness, between that which could act and that which could not. From this division arose the most fundamental ordering of all things, a multiverse composed of many planes, each governed by its own laws, yet bound together by a single, unyielding framework. This framework was not the work of the gods as mortals understand them. The gods came later. Before them stood forces whose authority did not depend on worship, temples, or prayer. These powers enforced boundaries. They defined limits. Among them, the overgod Ao would later become the only name remembered in the realms, not because he created everything, but because he ensured that creation could not collapse into chaos. The earliest structure of the multiverse separated existence into distinct states. The inner planes embodied matter, energy, and elemental substance. Earth, air, fire, and water formed not as metaphors, but as literal foundations of physical reality. Between them lay transitional realms, where pure elements bled into one another and raw substance resisted stable form. These planes were not places one traveled to easily. They were conditions of existence itself. Beyond them formed the outer planes, shaped not by matter, but by belief, alignment, and moral force. Law, chaos, good, and evil did not merely describe behavior. They exerted pressure on reality. Entire realms aligned themselves along these axes, becoming heavens, hells, and countless domains between. These planes existed because conviction itself had weight in the multiverse. This division mattered immediately. It ensured that no single force could dominate all others. Power was distributed, constrained by location and principle. A being born of fire could not rule water. A god bound to chaos could not fully command law. Balance was not peace, it was containment. Within this architecture, the first gods emerged. They did not create the planes they inhabited. They awakened within them. Each deity embodied an aspect permitted by the structure already in place. Their power was vast, yet conditional. They could shape, influence, and war within their domains, but they could not rewrite the rules that defined reality itself. This limitation was not theoretical. It was enforced. The earliest divine conflicts tested the multiverse almost immediately. Gods clashed over influence, territory, and authority, their struggles shaking entire planes. In these moments, a truth became undeniable. Unchecked divine action could tear the structure apart. Realms could fracture. Entire planes could be scarred or erased. Creation itself was not invincible. It was here that Io's role became clear. Not as a ruler issuing commands, but as an enforcer restoring separation. When gods exceeded their bounds, consequences followed. Power was withdrawn. Domains were reshaped. The lesson was simple and merciless. Existence would continue, but no god would be allowed to endanger it. This enforcement stabilized the multiverse. The planes remained distinct. The balance held, not because conflict ceased, but because it was limited. Only then did the conditions arise for something entirely new: worlds. The concept of a single, self-contained world, finite, vulnerable, and inhabited by mortals, was not inevitable. It required stability across planes, predictable boundaries, and limits on divine interference. Only when these conditions were met could realm space be permitted to form. This understanding reframes everything that follows. Faerûn was not the center of creation. It was an allowed outcome. By the time Teril would one day exist, the multiverse was already ancient, scarred by divine ambition and preserved by enforced restraint. Every god who would later claim dominion over Faerûn did so within rules older than memory. Every miracle, every catastrophe, every divine punishment would echo this primordial order. Faerûn's story begins, not with land or life, but with a multiverse designed to survive the gods themselves. The multiverse, once stabilized, did not exist as a single expanse, but as a layered system, each plane occupying a precise position defined by function rather than distance. This ordering was not aesthetic, it was preventative. Separation ensured survival. At the foundation lay the inner planes, realms of raw substance where the laws governing matter were absolute. Earth was not soil and stone as mortals would later know it, but infinite solidity, crushing in its permanence. Fire was not flame, but endless combustion, a place where form dissolved into heat and motion. Air stretched without boundary, pressureless and unanchored, while water existed as depth without shore or surface. These planes did not host life as mortals define it. They existed so that life elsewhere could. Between them formed regions of instability, the para-elemental and quasi-elemental planes, where opposing forces collided or decayed. Here, matter resisted permanence. These zones revealed an early truth of the multiverse. Not every region was meant to endure. Some existed as buffers, absorbing excess energy so the greater structure could remain intact. This arrangement answered a silent necessity. By isolating pure elemental forces, the multiverse prevented them from overwhelming all creation. Fire burned forever, but only where it was confined. Water drowned endlessly, but nowhere else. Containment was the first form of balance. Above this foundation, the outer planes took shape, and with them emerged a more dangerous variable: belief. These realms were not built from stone or flame, but from conviction itself. Law and chaos exerted gravitational pull. Good and evil shaped entire landscapes. A plane did not merely reflect alignment, it enforced it. Here, existence responded to thought. Structures formed where order dominated. Endless change ruled where chaos prevailed. Unlike the inner planes, these realms were malleable, reshaped continuously by the will and presence of powerful beings. This made them fertile ground for gods, and volatile beyond measure. The arrangement of the outer planes was not arbitrary. The Great Wheel model, known to scholars of the realms, illustrates a system where opposing forces counterbalanced one another. Law tempered chaos. Good constrained evil. Neutrality acted not as indecision, but as a stabilizing axis. This symmetry was intentional. It ensured that no philosophy could consume all others. The existence of such planes carried immediate consequence. Mortality became possible. For the first time, beings could exist who were neither elemental constants nor embodiments of alignment. Souls could form, act, change, and dissolve. Death became meaningful only because afterlives existed, places shaped by belief, judgment, or devotion. Without the outer planes, mortality would have been an ending without continuation. With them, death became transition. This is where the first gods truly asserted themselves. They did not invent belief, but they attracted it. Worship gathered around ideals already present in the multiverse. A god of order did not create law. Law allowed such a god to exist. This distinction defined divine limitation from the beginning. Gods gained strength through connection to mortals, yet remained bound to the planes aligned with their nature. A lawful deity could not thrive in pure chaos. An evil power could not reshape a realm of absolute good. The multiverse itself enforced these boundaries without negotiation. Conflict inevitably followed. Divine wars were not fought solely with armies or avatars, but with influence. When gods clashed, planes trembled, belief shifted. Entire regions of the outer planes were scarred, reshaped by victories and defeats that altered alignment itself. These struggles revealed a critical weakness. Belief could destabilize reality as surely as raw elemental force. This realization marked a turning point. The multiverse was not threatened by ignorance or emptiness, but by excess conviction. Ao's presence, distant yet absolute, became unavoidable in these moments. When balance tipped too far, intervention occurred. Not through persuasion or punishment as mortals understand them, but through correction. Divine access was restricted, power was diminished, domains were reassigned or erased, the structure was preserved, regardless of individual consequence. From this, an unspoken rule emerged among the gods. Survival required restraint. Influence must be cultivated, not imposed. Creation could proceed, but only within defined limits. This restraint made something unprecedented possible. A place where gods could act indirectly, where belief mattered but did not dominate, where elements combined into stable matter, where life could rise without tearing the planes apart. Worlds would not exist as expressions of divine will alone. They would exist as compromises. The multiverse, once a battlefield of absolutes, had become a controlled system capable of sustaining imperfection. That imperfection, finite, fragile, and limited, would soon become its greatest safeguard. With the structure of the multiverse enforced and its planes held in tension, the question was no longer whether worlds could exist, but under what conditions they would be permitted to endure. Creation, at this stage, was no longer an act of raw power. It had become an exercise in compliance. Worlds could not be formed within the inner planes. The elements there were too pure, too absolute. Fire consumed without pause. Earth crushed without mercy. Even the gods understood that life could not arise where substance itself refused balance. A different solution was required, one that allowed elements to mingle without domination. That solution appeared in the form of the material plane. Unlike any other realm, the material plane was defined by moderation. Elements coexisted in restrained proportions. Matter followed predictable laws. Change occurred gradually. It was not the most powerful plane, nor the most mutable, but it was stable. That stability made it rare. Scholars of the realms would later understand the material plane as a convergence point, a place where influences from the inner and outer planes met without overwhelming one another. Elemental forces provided substance. Outer planar energies granted meaning, morality, and the possibility of belief. The result was a realm capable of hosting life that could think, choose, and err. This convergence was not accidental. It was authorized. Ao's authority extended to the conditions under which worlds could be formed. Gods could shape realms within realm space, but only by adhering to constraints imposed by the multiverse itself. No single deity could claim total ownership. Influence would be shared, contested, and limited by law older than any pantheon. The creation of realm space, the crystal sphere that would one day contain Toril and its sister worlds, followed these principles precisely. It was enclosed, separated from the wider multiverse by barriers designed to prevent uncontrolled planar intrusion. This isolation was deliberate. Without it, the pressures of the planes would have rendered mortal existence impossible. Within realm space, gods acted through cooperation as much as rivalry. Deities associated with creation, growth, and order shaped the fundamental structure. Others introduced change, decay, and challenge. Each contribution carried consequence. Balance was not maintained by agreement, but by enforced interdependence. This interdependence revealed another critical limitation. Divine power within the material plane was inherently indirect. Gods could influence, inspire, or empower, but they could not exist fully without destabilizing the realm. Avatars, chosen servants, and miracles became the acceptable expressions of divinity. Direct presence was restricted. This limitation would later define countless events in Faerun's history, but its origin lay here. The gods accepted distance not as weakness, but as necessity. Within this controlled environment, the first mortal souls emerged. They were not copies of divine beings, nor accidents of elemental interaction. They were something entirely new, finite entities capable of belief, fear, loyalty, and doubt. Their thoughts carried weight in the outer planes, yet their bodies remained bound to the material. This dual nature made mortals indispensable. Through them, gods gained worship without direct domination. Through them, belief circulated without destabilizing the planes. Mortality became the mechanism by which the multiverse sustained both freedom and restraint. This was the midpoint of creation's logic. Worlds existed not for gods, but because of limits placed upon gods. Yet even this system was imperfect. The material plane, precisely because it was balanced, became vulnerable. It could be shaped, exploited, and contested in ways the absolute planes could not. Divine rivalry did not vanish. It adapted. The decision to allow worlds had solved one crisis while inviting another. Power could now be contested through influence rather than annihilation. Faith could be cultivated rather than enforced. And mortals, unaware of their role, became the arena upon which divine restraint would be tested again and again. By the time Taril's foundations were laid, the multiverse had already accepted a dangerous truth. Stability required something fragile enough to break. The formation of the material plane did not end divine ambition. It refined it. Once worlds were permitted to exist, the gods adapted their methods. No longer could dominance be achieved through raw force alone. Influence had to be cultivated slowly, through presence without permanence and power without full manifestation. This necessity reshaped divinity itself. Within realm space, the gods learned to act through portfolios, defined domains of authority that limited overlap and prevented total control. War, knowledge, death, magic, nature, tyranny, hope. These were not inventions of the gods, but roles recognized and enforced by the multiversal order. A deity could expand influence within a portfolio, but could not claim what was fundamentally opposed to its nature. This constraint mattered immediately. It prevented any single god from becoming absolute within the material plane. Even the most powerful deities were forced into coexistence, rivalry tempered by law older than their own existence. Conflict persisted, but annihilation was forbidden. The outer planes reflected these divisions. Divine realms formed not as arbitrary kingdoms, but as expressions of alignment and belief tied directly to a god's portfolio. A lawful deity's domain could not sustain chaos. A god of destruction could not flourish in a realm defined by preservation. The planes themselves resisted contradiction. This resistance became the silent governor of divine behavior. As gods expanded their influence, they discovered another limitation. Belief could empower, but it could also bind. The more a god aligned with mortal worship, the more its identity stabilized, and the less freedom it retained to change. A deity worshipped as a god of mercy could not easily become a god of cruelty without fracturing its own essence. This created an unspoken contract between gods and mortals. Worship granted power, but at the cost of definition. Mortals unknowingly shaped the gods they served. At the center of this system remained Ao, distant and unapproachable. Unlike the gods beneath him, Ao possessed no temples and accepted no prayers. His authority was structural, not personal. When divine disputes threatened the balance of realm space, intervention was not delayed by emotion or loyalty. It was immediate and absolute. The gods understood this well before Toril knew their names. This understanding shaped the final conditions under which Faerun would later arise. The material plane could not be ruled directly. Mortals had to be allowed agency, choice, and even rebellion. Without these elements, belief would stagnate, and with it, the balance of the outer planes. Thus, free will was not a gift born of kindness. It was a requirement of cosmic stability. Magic itself emerged within these boundaries. Rather than flowing freely from divine essence, it was structured into a system governed by rules. Maestra's later stewardship of the weave would exemplify this principle, but its origin lay earlier. Magic had to be regulated, or it would tear the material plane apart. Even gods were subject to this truth. By now, the multiverse had achieved a precarious equilibrium. The planes were distinct. Divine power was limited. Mortality functioned as both catalyst and containment. Creation had become sustainable, but only barely. This was the environment into which Toril would eventually be shaped. A world designed not to glorify gods, but to survive them. The truth revealed here is quiet, yet decisive. Faerun was never meant to be ruled absolutely. It was meant to endure within limits, imposed long before its skies ever formed. By the time the conditions for Toril's creation were met, the multiverse had already learned restraint the hard way. What followed was not a moment of triumph, but one of careful allowance. Realm space did not emerge as a blank canvas. It formed within a crystal sphere, a construct designed to isolate developing worlds from the destabilizing forces beyond. This barrier was not merely physical. It limited planar intrusion, moderated divine access, and ensured that the material plane within could evolve without constant interference from outer or inner planar extremes. In this enclosure, cause and effect were allowed to operate without immediate cosmic correction. This separation carried consequence. Gods could influence realm space, but they could not fully enter it at will. To do so required avatars, manifestations that carried only a fraction of divine essence. Even these were subject to restriction. Too much power, too direct a presence risked Io's intervention. The rules were not flexible, they were enforced. Within this sphere, Toril was shaped through cooperation and contention. Deities associated with creation, magic, nature, and order contributed to its structure. Others ensured entropy, death, and conflict were woven into its fabric. These forces were not flaws, they were safeguards. A world without death would stagnate. A world without conflict would cease to change. Toril was built to move forward, even at great cost. Here, a subtle but critical shift occurred. The gods were no longer the sole actors. Once Toril existed, it began to develop momentum of its own. Natural laws asserted themselves. Seasons turned, Land eroded. Life adapted. The world resisted divine redesign unless such change was gradual or indirect. This resistance was not sentient, but it was real. Mortals emerged within this system not as divine tools, but as variables. Their choices were unpredictable. Their beliefs shifted. Entire cultures rose and fell without divine instruction. This unpredictability became essential. It prevented stagnation in the outer planes and ensured that belief remained dynamic rather than fixed. Around the midpoint of Taril's early existence, the gods recognized an uncomfortable truth. They no longer fully controlled the outcome of creation. Influence could guide, but not dictate. Even coordinated divine action could be undermined by mortal choice, natural disaster, or the slow accumulation of unintended consequence. This realization redefined divine ambition. Power was no longer measured solely by raw might, but by adaptability. Gods who refused to accept limitations that weakened. Those who embraced indirect influence endured. Survival in the multiverse favored restraint over dominance. The outer planes reflected this shift. Divine realms stabilized, becoming less volatile as gods aligned themselves more closely with defined portfolios. Identity hardened. Change became costly. Immortality carried permanence, and permanence carried risk. Toril, small and fragile by cosmic measure, had become something unprecedented, a world capable of shaping the gods that watched it. This was not the final stage of creation, but it was the point of no return. The multiverse had committed to a model where imperfection was not tolerated, but necessary. Where freedom carried danger. Where balance was maintained not by peace, but by limitation. Faerûn would rise upon this foundation, inheriting every constraint, every consequence, and every unresolved tension encoded into the structure of reality itself. Long before Faerûn was mapped, named, or divided into nations, Toril existed in an age where divine intention and mortal outcome no longer aligned cleanly. This divergence was not accidental. It was the final test of the multiversal design. Once Toril proved capable of sustaining life without constant correction, the gods faced a narrowing of options. Continued intervention risked destabilizing the very balance that allowed the world to exist. Withdrawal, however, meant accepting uncertainty. For the first time since the multiverse was ordered, power encountered consequence it could not fully predict. This tension reshaped divine conduct across realm space. The gods began to rely on intermediaries, chosen mortals, prophetic figures, and later entire priesthoods, to project influence without direct presence. This system preserved distance while maintaining relevance, yet it introduced distortion. Divine intent filtered through mortal fear, ambition, and misunderstanding rarely emerged unchanged. This was not a flaw in the system. It was its function. Belief gained independence. Worship evolved beyond obedience into interpretation. A god's teachings could be honored, twisted, or quietly ignored. Over time, this variability fed back into the outer planes, subtly altering divine realms and even the gods themselves. Identity became less fluid. Contradiction carried cost. Here, the multiverse revealed a deeper safeguard. Because gods were shaped by belief, and belief was shaped by mortal experience, no deity could remain untouched by the consequences of its own influence. A god of war would reap devotion through conflict, but also resistance, fatigue, and eventual opposition. A god of tyranny could command fear, but fear bred rebellion. Power, when sustained too narrowly, eroded itself. This feedback loop discouraged absolutes. Around this stage in Taril's early existence, the separation between planes became more than structural. It became cultural. Mortals developed myths, cosmologies, and moral frameworks that only partially reflected cosmic truth. This ignorance was not corrected, it was permitted. The gods understood why. If mortals fully perceived the multiverse as it truly was, its planes, enforcers, and constraints, belief would calcify. Faith would become calculation. Worship would lose uncertainty, and with it, meaning. The system depended on partial knowledge. Thus, revelation was rationed. Magic followed the same principle. Though its source lay beyond the material plane, access was mediated through systems that limited scope and consequence. Spellcasting required study, sacrifice, or devotion. Catastrophic power demanded catastrophic cost. This ensured that mortal agency expanded gradually, never fast enough to rival divine force outright. Even so, the risk remained. The material plane, by design, was the most adaptable realm in existence. What could adapt could also threaten balance. Every innovation, every civilization, every philosophical shift carried implications beyond Teril itself. The multiverse tolerated this volatility because it was distributed. No single world could overturn everything. Realm space, however, would repeatedly test that assumption. What mattered now was not the perfection of the system, but its resilience. The multiverse no longer sought harmony, it sought endurance. By allowing Teril to persist despite uncertainty, the cosmos accepted a profound truth. Stability could no longer be imposed from above. It had to emerge from limitation, consequence, and restraint shared across gods and mortals alike. Faerun's future conflicts would never be isolated events. Each would echo decisions made when the multiverse chose imperfection over annihilation, and entrusted that imperfection to a fragile world beneath indifferent stars. As Toril continued to endure, the multiverse itself settled into a quieter phase, not peaceful, but sustained. The most volatile era of cosmic formation had passed. What remained was oversight. Realm space was no longer merely a protected environment. It became a proving ground, watched carefully by powers that rarely intervened but never ceased observing. The gods understood that Teril's survival was not guaranteed by strength, but by adherence to limits that could not be renegotiated. One of the clearest expressions of those limits was separation. Planar boundaries, once fluid during the earliest ages, grew increasingly rigid. Travel between planes became possible only through defined means: portals, rituals, divine sanction, or rare cosmic alignments. This was not done to isolate worlds completely, but to regulate exposure. Too much contact invited imbalance. Too little would render the planes irrelevant. The multiverse adjusted, narrowing the paths between realms rather than sealing them entirely. This adjustment reshaped divine strategy once more. Gods could no longer rely on proximity to sustain influence. They required continuity. Temples, doctrines, symbols, and traditions became essential tools. Faith had to persist through generations, not moments. A god who failed to maintain relevance faded, regardless of past power. Immortality no longer guaranteed permanence. This reality introduced a quiet form of mortality among the divine. Deities who lost worship did not simply vanish, they diminished. Their realms in the outer planes weakened. Their influence fractured. Some merged with other powers. Others fell into obscurity, remembered only in fragmented myths. The multiverse permitted this erosion without correction. It was not collapse. It was equilibrium asserting itself. Toril absorbed these shifts without understanding them. Mortals saw pantheons change, cults rise and fall, and divine mandates contradict one another across ages. What appeared as chaos was, in fact, regulation playing out over centuries rather than moments. At the midpoint of this long stabilization, another truth emerged, one that redefined Faerûn's eventual role. Worlds like Toril were no longer passive recipients of cosmic order. They had become participants. Mortal civilizations advanced, languages formed, histories accumulated. Memory itself became a force. Through story and record, mortals preserved interpretations of gods and cosmos that endured beyond any single generation. These interpretations fed belief. Belief shaped the outer planes, and the cycle continued. This meant that once Faerun would rise, it would not merely reflect the multiverse, it would influence it. The gods understood the implication, even if mortals did not. Divine conflict could no longer be resolved purely on higher planes. Outcomes on Toril would ripple outward, affecting belief structures across realm space and beyond. Mortal wars, discoveries, and disasters would carry cosmic weight. This recognition altered divine restraint into something closer to caution. Overgods like Ao did not need to issue new decrees. The system now enforced itself. Excessive interference weakened belief. Neglect allowed rivals to flourish. Every action carried consequence measured not in days, but in ages. The multiverse had reached functional maturity. It no longer required constant correction, because its most dangerous elements, gods and mortals alike, were bound by mutually reinforcing limitations. Power demanded followers. Followers demanded meaning. Meaning could not be forced without fracture. Faerûn, when it would finally emerge as a defined stage of history, rather than a conceptual possibility, would inherit this fully formed system. Its lands, conflicts, and faiths would be shaped not by chance, but by decisions embedded into reality long before its mountains rose. The creation of the multiverse did not culminate in perfection. It culminated in a structure capable of bearing consequence without unmaking itself. That structure would soon be tested, not by cosmic formation, but by history. By the era in which Faerûn would finally become recognizable, the multiverse had ceased to feel young. Its laws were no longer experimental. They were inherited. Toril's surface changed slowly, shaped less by divine intention than by accumulated consequence. Continents settled. Seas found boundaries. Climate stabilized into patterns that could sustain long memory. These developments were not guided moment by gods. They emerged because the material plane had been designed to resist constant correction. This resistance mattered more than any single divine act. The gods continued to influence Toril, but increasingly through alignment rather than command. A deity's presence became visible not through direct manifestation, but through patterns, where civilizations rose, where magic flourished or failed, where conflict became cyclical rather than catastrophic. Divine fingerprints appeared in repetition, not interruption. Faerûn began as a region shaped by this subtlety. It was not chosen because it was favored, but because it was viable. Its geography allowed migration. Its resources encouraged settlement. Its instability was sufficient to generate belief without collapsing into extinction. From the multiverse's perspective, it was functional. This reframing strips Faerûn of any illusion of destiny. It was not created to be special. It became significant because it endured. As mortal societies formed, they did so under inherited constraints they could not perceive. Free will existed, but it operated within boundaries encoded into reality itself. Empires could rise, but not indefinitely. Magic could advance, but never without cost. Faith could unify, but never without division. These limits did not prevent greatness, they defined it. At this stage, the gods faced a narrowing horizon of control. Their roles were established, their portfolios hardened. Adaptation became slower, more dangerous. A god who overreached risked not correction, but erosion, loss of relevance, dilution of belief, fragmentation of identity. Some deities embraced this permanence, others resisted it. The multiverse did not intervene to resolve these tensions. It no longer needed to. The system now relied on inertia. Power that aligned with reality persisted. Power that contradicted it weakened. This applied to gods and mortals alike. Faerun's early cultures absorbed these truths without awareness. Mythology encoded them. Law reflected them. Conflict reinforced them. Over generations, mortals learned, through failure rather than revelation, that no force ruled forever. Even the gods could be challenged, if not defeated. This understanding altered belief itself. Worship became conditional. Faith became selective. Mortals did not abandon the gods, but they negotiated with them through tradition, ritual, and resistance. This dynamic fed back into the outer planes, further stabilizing divine identities while limiting their reach. The midpoint of Faerun's emergence marked a decisive shift. The world was no longer simply surviving within the multiverse. It was participating in its maintenance. Every prayer, every rebellion, every act of defiance or devotion reinforced the principle that had governed creation since its earliest division. Power must be constrained, or it destroys the structure that sustains it. Faerûn did not need to know the multiverse's origin to fulfill its role within it. The role had already been written into the laws of existence: to endure, to change, to resist absolute control. By this point, the creation of the multiverse had completed its most subtle work. It had produced not a perfect world, but a world capable of bearing imperfection without unraveling. Faerûn stood upon that foundation, not as a chosen land, but as a consequence fully realized. As Faerûn entered recorded history, the ancient constraints embedded in the multiverse began to reveal themselves through repetition rather than revelation. Patterns emerged, not prophecies, but consequences recurring under different names and eras. Again and again, moments arose when gods pressed too close to the material plane, seeking certainty where only influence was permitted. Each time, the same tension resurfaced: divine will against structural law. The multiverse did not respond with punishment in the mortal sense. It responded with correction. Access narrowed, power redistributed. Balance reasserted itself. These corrections were never arbitrary. They followed principles established long before Toril cooled beneath its first skies. No god could act without cost. No victory could remain absolute. When divine ambition exceeded its boundaries, the outcome was not triumph, but limitation. Mortals experienced these shifts as upheaval. Pantheons reorganized. Divine authority appeared to fracture or consolidate. Faiths collapsed or surged. To those living through such eras, history felt unstable, even cruel. Yet beneath the surface, the same structure held, the same rules endured. Faerûn became a mirror that reflected the multiverse back upon itself. Each major crisis demonstrated the same truth in different forms. Divine power depended on relevance. Relevance depended on belief. Belief depended on mortal experience. And mortal experience resisted total control. This chain could not be broken without unraveling the system that sustained both gods and worlds. At the midpoint of Faerûn's long testing, the implication became unavoidable. The gods were no longer the sole custodians of meaning. Mortals were not merely participants, they were stabilizers. Through skepticism, reform, syncretism, and resistance, mortals prevented belief from becoming static. Faith evolved because societies evolved. Gods who adapted persisted. Those who could not faded, fragmented, or were absorbed. The multiverse allowed this without intervention because it preserved balance more effectively than force ever had. AO's authority remained absolute, but increasingly unnecessary. The structure no longer required frequent enforcement. It functioned because its participants, divine and mortal alike, had learned its limits through consequence rather than decree. This was the true inheritance of creation. Faerûn's significance did not lie in its heroes, its empires, or its catastrophes alone. It lay in its role as proof that a world could endure sustained divine interest without collapsing. Proof that belief could shape gods without destroying reality. Proof that imperfection, when constrained, was not a flaw, but a stabilizing force. From the multiverse's perspective, Faerûn was no longer an experiment. It was evidence. The structure established before any world existed had succeeded, not by eliminating conflict, but by ensuring conflict could never become final. No victory could erase all others. No truth could remain unchallenged forever. No power could stand without cost. This understanding reframes every age of Faerûn's history. What appears as chaos is regulation playing out over time. What seems like divine failure is often structural success. By surviving its trials without breaking the laws that preceded it, Faerûn confirmed the multiverse's oldest decision, that endurance mattered more than perfection, and restraint more than control. The creation of the multiverse had found its answer, not in silence or stasis, but in a world that continued, changed, and endured within limits it never chose, yet could not escape. By the time Faerûn's later ages began to define themselves through written record, the framework established before creation was no longer questioned. It was simply lived within. Gods, mortals, and even planes acted as if these limits had always existed, because by then, they effectively had. What distinguished this stage was not the presence of divine power, but its predictability. Intervention followed patterns. Withdrawal followed excess. Every great upheaval echoed an earlier one, not in detail, but in outcome. The multiverse no longer experimented. It responded. Faerûn's repeated crises revealed a final refinement of cosmic design. Absolute destruction never arrived uninvited. Cataclysms occurred, but they stopped short of erasure. Civilizations fell, but the world endured. Gods lost power, but divinity itself remained intact. The structure absorbed shock without collapse. This resilience was not accidental. It was the consequence of layered restraint. Mortal agency disrupted certainty. Divine limitation prevented domination. Planar separation contained fallout. Even when balance tilted, it did not break. At the center of this endurance lay an unspoken correction mechanism: memory. Mortals remembered failure. Faith adapted. Cultures adjusted behavior in response to disaster. This accumulation of experience slowed repetition, even when it could not prevent it entirely. The multiverse tolerated repetition, but not stagnation. Gods, bound by belief, felt this pressure as erosion or reinforcement. Those aligned with lived reality persisted. Those clinging to outdated expressions of power diminished. No decree announced their decline. It happened because relevance waned. From this perspective, Faerûn was no longer merely surviving within cosmic law. It was enforcing it indirectly. Every choice made by mortals, whether to worship, resist, reinterpret, or abandon, fed into the same stabilizing loop that had governed creation since the first separation of planes. The gods could influence outcomes, but they could not nullify consequence. The multiverse did not need to intervene when its participants upheld its limits themselves. This was the quiet culmination of the creation process. The multiverse had not produced a flawless system. It had produced one capable of learning without awareness. Correction no longer required force. It emerged through participation. Faerûn, with all its contradictions, had become indispensable, not because it was powerful, but because it functioned exactly as the multiverse required: imperfect, contested, finite, and enduring. What remained was not another adjustment, but closure. The structure that preceded Faerûn had achieved its purpose. Everything that followed would unfold within boundaries already proven unbreakable. The creation of the multiverse no longer needed defense. Its design had been tested across ages and had held. At the end of this long unfolding, the creation of the multiverse resolves not as an event, but as a condition that continues to hold. Before Faerûn existed, reality was shaped to survive power. After Faerûn endured, that purpose was confirmed. The planes remained distinct. Gods remained limited. Mortals remained unpredictable. None of these outcomes were accidents. Together, they formed a system that could absorb ambition, belief, and conflict without erasing itself. From this vantage, the role of Ao and the overgods becomes clearer. They were never architects of detail. They were custodians of boundary. Once those boundaries proved self-sustaining, once gods adapted, mortals asserted agency, and worlds persisted without constant correction, the need for overt enforcement diminished. Authority receded not because it weakened, but because it succeeded. Faerûn's history, with all its wars, divine crises, and shifting pantheons, does not contradict this design. It fulfills it. Each upheaval reaffirmed the same principle established before the first world was allowed to form. No force may remain absolute without consequence. Not gods, not empires, not belief itself. The multiverse did not seek harmony. Harmony would have required stasis, and stasis would have led to collapse. Instead, it sought endurance through limitation. Change was permitted, even encouraged, so long as it did not unravel the structure that supported it. Imperfection was not tolerated, it was required. Seen in this light, Faerûn is neither chosen nor exceptional. It is representative. A world shaped by constraint, sustained by consequence, and defined by its inability to reach absolutes. Its significance lies not in destiny, but in function. Every prayer uttered on its soil, every god challenged or upheld, every civilization that rose and fell within its bounds served the same ancient purpose: to keep belief dynamic, power contested, and reality intact. The multiverse did not need to speak this truth aloud. It embedded it into existence itself. Before Faerûn existed, the multiverse was designed to withstand gods. After Faerûn endured, that design was proven sufficient. What remains is not mystery, but clarity. The cosmos of the Forgotten Realms is not governed by hidden chaos or secret will. It is governed by limits older than memory, enforced not by constant command, but by consequence allowed to unfold. Faerûn stands because it was never meant to escape those limits, and as long as it endures within them, the multiverse endures as well.